increasingly important in our domain, storytelling. Before we begin, as you know, yesterday was a Multiculturalism Day, and I'd like to read a short excerpt of our Prime Minister's statement. Canada has shown time and time again that a country can be stronger, not in spite of its differences, but because of them. As Canadians, we appreciate the freedom we have to show pride in our individual identities and ancestries. No matter our religion, where we were born, what color our skin, or what language we speak, we are equal members of this great country. Our roots reach out to every corner of the globe. We are from far and wide and speak over 200 languages. Our national fabric is vibrant and varied, woven together by many cultures and heritages, and underlined by a core value of respect. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue. Pour votre information, la session d'aujourd'hui sera exclusivement en langue anglaise, une session en français étant en préparation pour une date ultérieure. Toutefois, vous pouvez, si vous le souhaitez, poser des questions en français en gardant à l'esprit que la réponse vous sera donnée en anglais. We have with us today Chris Kavanagh, Kevin Frank, Teresa Healy, Bernie Hune, Anna Kurtz, and Teddy Sirrett. Welcome, everyone. You'll find all information about our panel on our website. Two members, unfortunately, were not able to come today. Stories have been vital to all cultures throughout history. Recently, they have been purposefully employed as tools to promote empathy between adversaries and to help people heal from past trauma. According to Hannah Arendt, storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. People are drawn to stories for a number of reasons, says Julia Chaitin. They can entertain us, help us, organize our thoughts, fill us with emotion, keep us in suspense, or instruct us in how to live and act. They also often present a dilemma concerning what is moral and immoral behavior. At times, stories can also heal us when we feel broken or ill, moving us toward new psychological understanding of self and our social world. Telling one's story has been shown to be a key experience for people who have undergone severe social trauma. This has been the case for Holocaust survivors who have given their testimonies in institutions around the world, such as Yale University. The recounting of personal stories in situations which aim to reduce conflicts and to enhance peace building and reconciliation has been used in a number of contexts around the world. Given the importance of storytelling, my first question today to our panel will be, how do you build a story? Who wants to answer to this? Somebody wants to begin?
I would begin.
All right, so we'll just turn the computer. So Kevin Frank.
Toronto.
I was on mute.
Yeah.
I think I'm still on mute.
Why is
There
you go.
Hi everyone, I'm Kevin Frank and I'm the Artistic Director of the Second City Training and Education Program here in Toronto. I've been an improviser for 35 years, been the Artistic Director for almost 10, so I've heard a few stories in my day. We have the luxury at the Second City to make up our stories as we go. We collaborate with others and build stories together, and the most important thing is the truth. When we include the truth in what we're talking about, people connect to it immediately. So as long as you're including a kernel of truth from what you believe and know and experience, you can build from there and people will connect with that. We create stage productions through improv, telling stories over and over until we've crafted them into a perfect comedy sketch. And one of the things we keep our mind focused on is the truth. So telling your story is more talking about what you know from your point of view. And I always like to encourage my storytellers to go into the details that you think are pretty mundane, kind of boring, kind of everyone should know those, because they don't. And sometimes those details, sometimes the depth that you go into, a little piece of data, really inspires someone to learn more about your story and stay engaged. So that's one of the tips that I like to share with my storytellers is make sure you have a grain of truth in there, and that connects people to your story and engages them. That's my input for now.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So who next? Anna?
Well, that's really interesting. My name is Anna Kurtz. I'm a retired teacher and a storyteller in Toronto. I'm also an author, and I write personal stories and I tell personal stories. And one of the things that I learned early on was never let the truth interfere with a good story. So although you want to have truth at the core of your story, when you're developing your story, you don't necessarily have to stay in a chronological order. You don't have to stay with the entire truth, because sometimes just repeating the truth and just repeating the events as they happened can be really boring. Sometimes you have to think, okay, so what will I do to make the story more interesting? What can I do to make the story move ahead? What can I do to add some action? And one of the things that I find really works well is to add some dialogue. If you can get your characters to speak, which is really important, I find the story comes alive when characters speak. One of the stories I tell is when I was a child and my grandmother came to visit us just as we were getting ready to leave to Canada. And because we had only one bedroom, my mom and dad slept in one bed and I slept with my grandmother in the other bed. And so I can say, well, my grandmother slept with me the night before we came to Canada, and I didn't like sleeping with her. And when I woke up, she was sad and I was sad. But I wanted something else to happen in the story. I wanted some dialogue. And so when I had my grandmother in the bed and I woke up, she said, I'm going to die alone. She was talking to my mother. I'm going to die alone. And I knew that she was crying, and I knew that my mother was crying. And although, in all honesty, I didn't like my grandmother, I sat up and said, I'll stay with you. And to give my grandmother a chance to speak, she said, Kinderwille is Hingelstreck, which most people don't understand, so I can translate it for you and say, the wants of children are chicken shit, which adds some personality from my grandmother, adds a little humor to the story, takes us out of the really sad part, because when your story is really sad, you don't want it to be dark all the way through. It's really nice if you can add a little bit of humor. So, action, dialogue, humor. Those are my contributions right now.
Thank you very much, Anna. So, Bernice is going to be next.
My name is Bernice Hune. Oh, am I on? My name is Bernice Hune, and I'm a Gumsan Gold Mountain storyteller, the name that Cantonese Voices gave Canada in the 1850s. I collect community oral history stories. I didn't know I was doing this when I was young, but there were at that time nothing in my outside world at school, right up to university, that gave me, my world was kind of split in what happened at home and in the community and what happened in terms of what was available in the general world. This was before we had this word multiculturalism. In fact, I was at the first conference of multiculturalism in 1973. So they were uncles and aunts to me, but they were the First Order of Canada, the first Chinese doctor, and the first Chinese lawyer. So much later in life, I could kind of tell their stories because I had, in effect, had heard them. But they were, and they kept their, the older community didn't speak of the past so readily with young people. I would say, speak the language you're comfortable in. Use the words you're comfortable in. It's about communication, and if you're happier starting with a joke, a riddle, a narrative, anything that makes you smile, laugh, sad, or scared, those points. Work with something that has meaning to you, and memories are important. You may just have a memory and not be able to shape it yet, but that memory is attached to some emotion, and for some reason that's important, and it will develop into a story. Things have happened very slowly for me. It may not be that way for you, but I needed, in my generation, had to go to historical facts to verify what was going on, because I couldn't tell if they would say junlei, jun. This was a word that constantly came up, it was forbidden. But there was nothing in the books around me that told me what was forbidden. Like, you couldn't go back, you had to get back in the country before 2 years, or you would lose your place in Canada. I couldn't find that information anywhere. So for me, I had to verify some of the historical facts. Now that has taken time as well, because the cohort that produced the books in English, because I can't read Chinese. I mean, I'm one of those kids that, you know, kind of half went to sleep in Chinese after school classes. And so if you're working from community stories, it takes time. Speak to the elders in your community and go with your own interests. If you're interested in sports, go with that. If you're interested in music, talk to people who work in those areas as well. And I think that's all I'll say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernice. So I think, Chris, you want to talk? Okay, so I'm going to turn the computer.
Hi, Chris Kavanaugh here. What I think I'll add to what Kevin, it's Kevin, right?
That's right.
And Anna and Bernice have said, which is all great, and so I put exclamation marks behind all that. When I think of personal stories in particular, which I know is germane to this project, I think of paying attention perhaps to the difference between what we call anecdote and story. Let's call the difference between anecdote and story. Because I find a lot of personal stories exist as anecdote. And they can be told often with just a saying. In a family that understands its history, sometimes whole stories, whole episodes of families will be referred to with one little saying. And if you're not part of that group, you won't even notice that a story was kind of told. You know, and it's gone. But when we're trying to tell our own stories, and especially work with other people to help them tell their stories, it's important to develop an ear for how personal stories in particular, move amongst us, and seeing the difference between anecdote and story is a good example. So one example from my own life is something that I learned late in my mother's life. One day she said, oh yeah, when I first moved to Quebec, I didn't go out of the house for 6 months. And my mother is Acadian, and I was raised in New Brunswick for part of my life. And she said that, and I don't even think I was paying attention. But then it struck me later as odd, and so I said, what do you mean you didn't go out of the house for 6 months when you were in Quebec? And she was responding, I think, to something I had said about discrimination. And I hadn't even put the pieces together, but when I asked her, she said that she spent her first 6 months living in Quebec, watching Quebec television to lose her accent. And I thought, wow, she had never ever shared any history of discrimination or shame around the way she spoke. But I always knew she had that. And there it was in this little anecdote of a piece of her life that that slipped out. Now, that's not a story entirely. It's a small experience. So to move from that anecdote or any anecdote to a story requires the kind of work that you've just heard from other people, as well as, if you're helping somebody tell their own story, asking them how that experience fits in other experiences, to connect it to others. My mother's life story, which I won't get into, is not necessarily a life story of just being a victim. She survived, she did all sorts of things, but how does that anecdote fit in all the other things that she did in her life? Having 4 kids, moving from the Maritimes to Toronto first, and then Montreal, and then back and forth. How did that anecdote fit in all of that? And how did she make sense of it? So when we're making stories, one of the things we're doing is taking those pieces of our experience and trying to figure out how they fit together. And if we're going to tell them, either orally or through video or other means, then we need to make them interesting and captivating, which is some of the advice we've heard as well. So I won't repeat that as well. Personal stories work the same way as all other stories. They need tension, they need drama, they need resolution, they need humor, they need all those things. And so I want to, again, I'm underlining the value of working with anecdote, I think especially with personal stories. You know, a lot of people's personal experience never even moves out of the anecdote because nobody ever stops to ask, you know, how does that fit with what I know about you? And so the anecdote is you could say, is a building block of the kind of stories we're talking about here. So I'll leave it at that.
So thank you very much, Chris. We're going to take so our 2 panelists who signed in today. So I guess Teresa or Teddy. Sure. Okay, we'll begin by Teddy, the one I have just like facing me. So Teddy, if you want to give us your answer to the question. Yeah, so maybe, I think maybe we lost the connection with Teddy, so shall we, oh, okay, no, he is back. All right, Teddy. Okay, no, sorry about this, we lost the connection with Teddy, so we're going to ask Teresa, if you don't mind, Teresa, to answer the question. Sorry about all that.
Not at all, it's my great pleasure to be here with such a wonderful group of storytellers and facilitators. And I think that maybe where I would start is just by saying that I'm connected to story in a number of different ways. I work as a professor of sustainable development, and recently I've started to use digital storytelling as part of a way of inviting students to come to a place of reflection. And you're gesturing, Tomas, can you hear me okay? Oh, good, very good, all right. So I invite students to come to a place of reflection through their stories. And I've begun doing this work with the Center for Digital Storytelling, or Story Center. At the moment, we're doing some work both in the United States and in Canada. And Story Center has a way has introduced me to storytelling in a way that asks the storyteller to think a lot about the narrative and to begin by reflecting with a group of people so that the process of reflection doesn't happen alone, and by creating a very short script, you know, something like 600 to 750 words, or even less. Whatever takes about 3 minutes to speak once it's written. And in this method, it resonates with me very deeply, because I realize that what the storyteller is able to do is to reflect on something important in their lives, and through a process of dialogue with the other people in the story circle, come to deeper reflection on one's own life. And so I think, you know, as you started our discussion asking about how to build the story, I think that's how at the moment I'm really working with story. Is to for myself and for the students and students I'm working with, is to ask for them to think about it as a practice, a reflective practice. So what's going on in their lives, what's going on in their work that they feel that they want to tell a story about? What's significant enough to spend an amount of time developing a script in relation with other people? And just like I also do the story through songwriting as well, I think of it in that way, and poetry. But I think of it in the same way. This is a practice that I feel resonates with other places where I do work. And it's that in taking something big and making it small, it becomes more immediate, more specific, more tangible. There's more color and texture. And so when I'm working with students to develop their narratives, when they're way out in big issues, like for example, a lot of the students I work with are international students, or they go to different countries or different locations in order to do their research. So they might find themselves saying to me something like, I'm so concerned about inequality, or I'm so concerned about the racism and the food deserts that the communities of color are experiencing, and this is overwhelming me. I say, okay, let's be specific. What does the food desert look like? Have you taken a walk around the community? Can you describe for me what your interaction was like last time you went to the supermarket or to the corner store? And it's through that specific description and the deep observation and self-reflection that the story starts to emerge.
Thank you very much, Teresa. So I'm wondering if we have Teddy back on connection. No, we don't have Teddy back on connection. So maybe what we're going to do, if you don't mind, we're working. Pran here is working and trying to get Teddy back. What I propose we do is I'm going to ask you the next question I want you to answer. We'll answer, and then we'll go back to Teddy. All right. So the next question I really needed to answer, and I don't need all of you to basically answer. It's related to what I said in my introduction. The fact that like recently, stories have been purposefully employed as tools to promote empathy between adversary or help people heal from past trauma. So the power of personal stories. You already all mentioned here. How do you encourage somebody to tell their story? And in different, it can be different kind of story. It's not necessarily, I'm looking at Kevin, because it's not necessarily like traumatic story or anything. It's their story, whatever people have. And I know that in the second city, it's basically what it is about. It's like, you know, helping people tell what they have inside. So yeah, so who wants to answer first? Or Kevin?
Oh, I think.
Here we are. So we often create a safe and nurturing environment where someone can feel like when they start to tell their story, they won't be judged. So you really do have to create an openness about yourself, take away any questions that you might have at the beginning, because sometimes that feels like you're judging. So just allow them to start to begin to talk, and then just use some really active listening tools like eye contact and nodding and smiles and acknowledgement when they introduce an interesting fact. But do it silently and physically. And we communicate with each other through much more than just our words. 80% of our communication is body language and the space between our words, and 20% are the words we use. So use that 80% that we communicate with to continually encourage the person who's speaking through positive gestures and nodding and smiling and eye contact, and that creates a really lovely atmosphere where they don't feel judged, and they'll continue to foreclose or disclose more information to build on their story. I've often thought that's a good place to start when you want someone to tell their story.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Does somebody want to add something? And Anna and Teresa, I'm trying to look at your little icon. So if you want to add something, like
I think those are all really important, especially the positive reinforcement for storytelling. I think it's also really great if you have a place where you can go to share your story and to listen to other people tell. If you've never told, it's sometimes daunting to be the person who has to get up and tell. There are places in the city where you can go and listen to storytellers. It might be a place like 1001 Nights of Storytelling in Toronto, but there are places like that in most of the cities across Canada. If you go online, you can find different places where they tell personal stories in Toronto. So you can go and listen to somebody else. Encourage somebody who's never told a story to listen to other storytellers. It's motivating, and it gives you the courage to try something on your own.
Thank you very much. So we'll hear Chris.
Sure. I would add to, in terms of listening, is to train your ear, perhaps, to listen for the different types of telling that people do. And I'll draw a distinction between reporting and telling, because a lot of people, like, all they can do is report their experience, report what happened, and there are storytellers, I won't judge them, who don't know how not to report a story rather than tell it. And so a reported story is, and then in the story, what happened was this guy got off his horse. And then the next thing that happened was, and it's got all this fill-in stuff. And so you're always being taken out of the story. Now that's good journalism, maybe. You know, not my example, but reporting is a necessary form of storytelling. But it's also a way that some people are caught with their experience, that they themselves don't understand the story that is in their experience. And so all they can do at the moment is report it. And that should be respected. I'm not judging reporting as bad. And if that's where somebody is at, then listen to the report and see what more information you can get. But to move from reporting the facts, if you will, it's often the facts, it's sequential, it's the events, to a story means filling in meaning that connects all the different facts. And those meanings are numerous and multiple. One story can mean many different things, of course. And it depends on how one tells it, but also first, how one makes sense of it to oneself. And so I'll add that. In terms of listening, there are different types of things we're listening to. You know, I draw a distinction between reporting and telling, where telling is what we're after, you know. And that's different, again, I won't go into it, but just by way of example, narrating. Narrating is a different type of telling as well, you know. But I'll leave it at just drawing the distinction between reporting and telling. When we're listening to people tell stories, what mode are they in? And then what can we do to help them, which is a whole bunch of other stuff. It goes back to what's been said already, and so on.
Thank you very much, Chris. Would you want to, Bernice, want to add something? Yep.
That stories in Canada, people are pushed sometimes out of a country and they're pulled to Canada. And it's, especially if you're going to an older person, there's now a lot more information about some of the unrest that's gone on, why some elder might have come to Canada. And it's good just to do research, to understand perhaps the political events, the historical events. In my own lifetime, because there was so little available in print when I was young, I had a disconnect, because everything I read in English about China or Chinese was removed from the Cantonese voices that I heard in my community and in my family home. So for a very long time, I just didn't read what was in English until I could make some sense of it, because it just didn't connect with something else that was going on. Now, you might not have the same experience, but I think if you're working with any historical information, just do some research, prepare some questions, and at the end of someone opening up and talking to you, just review them to see if you've got all the, that all the questions have been answered.
Thank you very much, Bernice. Teresa, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd love to. And also I'm learning so much from other people who are speaking, the idea of not being judged or forming a community of practice or trying to sort out what telling is or trying to get to the deeper cultural meaning that's sometimes marginalized. I mean, these are such great insights, and I'm wondering if they're making me think of an element that's important to me, which is to try to find that moment of insight and to find it as I'm telling my story, to work with students who are also trying to develop a place of reflection. It's that looking for that moment, that moment of insight. Maybe this is, Chris, what related to what you're speaking of in moving from reporting to telling. But you know, how do we go spiraling, not in circles, but spiraling deeper and deeper into something that's meaningful to us? How do we come to the heart or the crystallization of something? And I think in trying to encourage people and not judging, as Kevin was saying, is perhaps to say, let's spiral around that one more time. What else is there? What else is there to say about that? Or maybe if the story is being constructed or written in the context of a story circle, then maybe with care, a facilitated discussion can also help the storyteller amongst peers say, oh, yeah, what else is, there's something more maybe we could say here, or could you be more specific about that, or that really drew my attention, could you tell me more about that? These sorts of encouragements, I think, are helpful if the story is to be constructed in a community setting.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We're still trying to connect with Teddy. It's going to be the ongoing story of the day, and it's good that we have a story that's going on as we're. So I'm going to ask the second question. I wanted to ask before we take questions from the audience. Now, the other side of the equation. How do you encourage people to listen to other people's stories? Because stories, it takes two persons. It takes somebody who tells a good story, and again, turn towards Kevin, it takes an audience. It takes people who are interested in this story. So how do you encourage people listening to story? Who wants to take this first? Anna?
I don't mean to start first every time, but I'm really comfortable with this topic as well. I always remind our storytellers that there are two parts to your story. There's the sound and there's the picture. And if you omit the picture, you miss out on the opportunity to engage the person into your story. So your body language and your eye contact and your energy and your pacing are all really important tools to use as you storytell. Because when you stop, people lean in. If you give a gap, or your hands and your face gets wide with excitement, they gain that energy through that vision. So there's so much more to storytelling than just the words. And so I encourage storytellers to keep people engaged by giving them something to look at that supports rather than conflicts with what you're saying. You know, if I came into this conference and I said, I'm very excited to be here today. I've prepared a lot, and I'm so thrilled. On paper, that sounds great, but the way I presented it, everyone's thinking he's a liar. That's the farthest thing from the truth. So we always want to make sure that our energy and our body language supports rather than conflicts with what we're saying, so that it feels authentic and it's engaging visually when you're telling the story.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the demonstration. Yeah, we here in the room have seen that you're totally right. And I take this opportunity to congratulate you because she's able to attract our attention by being just a small icon in our computer, while we have the presence of the room, but you're able to still draw the attention. So good job at storytelling. Who else wants to add somebody, Chris?
Sure. In terms of listening, first of all, the question, we're talking about getting audiences to listen, or listening in terms of helping people tell their stories as well? There's different kinds of listening.
So yeah, so that's an interesting distinction. Me, I was in mind, how do you get one person to have interest in somebody else's story? But I like what you're saying. So it's our audience, obviously, but the other thing you say is that, like, to listen, like, do both.
Okay. Well, on the audience, Anna mentioned the 1001 Friday Nights of Storytelling here in Toronto, and so one answer is to establish an environment that is conducive to listening, whatever that might be. Now, the Friday night storytelling is a particular environment. There's 30, 50 people in a room. You know, there's candles lit. You know, and the story, the teller, and the moment of listening is very obvious. But other environments are, you know, you might have. I did a session with my students from York University in my house a couple of months ago, and there were 12 of us sitting around my living room, and everybody had a chance to tell. And there was an opportunity there to be a bit more social than kind of audience. And yet people needed their moment to tell. And so we can't expect that everybody will know, especially from the different cultures that, you know, come together to listen, that everybody will have the same culture of listening. Some cultures of listening have a lot of interrupting in them. And it's just like, oh yeah, tell us more about that. What was that about? Oh yeah, oh, I know what you're talking about. But if you're not from a culture that has that kind of interruption, you might get thrown off your story, or the teller might get thrown off the story. So the environments are going to be very different. So give some thought to that environment, I'll say. In terms of the kind of listening to draw somebody out, you know, Kevin already used the term active listening and all the tools of active listening. And I want to, you know, doubly underline that in terms of what that, and it's where Google active listening. Like, in addition to everything Kevin said, there's lots of approaches and techniques. But one thing I'll cite perhaps that came to mind is, and Google this too, check out some episodes of This American Life. Yeah. And the interviewers on This American Life, Ira Glass and others, in my opinion, are master listeners. And as interested as I am in the stories that are told, and they're great, I am equally interested as a storyteller and somebody who researches narrative and all that stuff, to listen to how the interviewers draw out stories. It's active. Now, it's radio, so they don't have body and image to use. But in their voices and the way they ask, and the camaraderie and the connection and with the stories, it is really, every episode is a lesson in how to listen to other people, not passively, but actively, and not intrusively to get them to tell their story in a particular way, but always inviting them and creating the opportunity for people to tell their story. And maybe I'll end on that point, creating the opportunity. How is your listening creating an opportunity?
Thank you, Chris, and I hope you've been all practicing active listening at home and that you're sending us waves of energy. Who else wants to add something about this topic?
I'd like to add something if I could. This makes me think about a project that I was involved with a wonderful storyteller named Ruth Stewart Berger a number of years ago. And we were interested in the famous five and the women who were struggling to have women recognized as persons. And as we got deeper into this project, we decided to focus on one person. And Ruth was particularly taken by the character of Emily Murphy because of her contradictions. And as we got to know this person through our research, I started to feel incredibly uncomfortable about telling this story because she was very racist, and she had a view of what was needed for middle-class white women in terms of her struggle for personhood and the vote and other sorts of things. So the way I tackled the complexity of this story was that I said, okay, first of all, not everyone, we're not born racist, right? So what can I do about her in her childhood? And I wrote this song. Oh yeah, I forgot to say that Ruth was doing the narrative. I was writing the songs to go along. And so I created this song about Emily Murphy when she was a child called Sunshine. She grew up in Cookstown, a town I knew well. I grew up close to there myself. And so I wrote this song trying to, try to understand, as a child, la 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 la. And then at another moment, I said, okay, this just gets worse. When she becomes a judge, she makes all kinds of judgments about poor working class women, and this isn't getting any better. So I thought, okay, I'm going to tackle this, but I'm going to tell it from the point of view, perhaps the imaginary point of view of a young woman who was sentenced by Judge Murphy. And I tried to sort of bring the perspective of the young woman into the story. And it was through these kind of like opening up the contradictions, trying to. So Ruth and I both did different elements of this. When the story went, and we had to talk about how she felt about drugs or how she felt about Chinese immigration, it was to try to say, okay, let's look at this. Let's bring the different characters into this story so that the story isn't determined by the main character. Do you see what I mean? To try to say that we're not the one voice cannot predominate in this context, because sometimes we don't look at the deeper complexities of that struggle in that moment of time.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We now are able to connect with Teddy, so we're going to jump back to the former question so that he can give us his point of view about basically how to build a story. So if we can maybe Teddy speaking.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Very well.
Okay, perfect. Greetings, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Sorry for the connection here on my end. Technology just is one of those things we have to deal with. Now, to beginning to develop a story. So with my background, first of all, I'm an Ojibwe First Nation Two-Spirited person from Northern Ontario. I previously resided in Sault Ste. Marie, originally from Bechuana First Nation and Rincon Reserve, and have always been interested in reading and writing and telling different stories and making up stories. My background is also in theater, so that kind of helps me with the current work that I'm doing now as a queer, Indigenous, and Two-Spirit advocate. So when it comes to building a story, I always think it always depends on like who the audience is, for one, but also like my connection and what my buy-in or interest is in with the audience and what stories I feel like sharing. When it comes down to with my advocacy work, I just do. A lot of this is very story-based and from a personal impact on like how I've been impacted by the world and how the world impacts me being a queer, Indigenous person of color who's also gender fluid. So my expression can fluctuate between masculinity and femininity. And for a lot of people, it opens up a lot of questions when I walk on stage or if I walk into a classroom or a lecture hall. Automatically, there's a lot of questions because sometimes I'm wearing mascara and heels and either a dress or some kind of fancy slacks, and that really ties into the whole kind of presentation, because when you tell a story, you are presenting. I'm always mindful of what I wear or how I present, because the one thing that I add with my storytelling is that it's the feedback afterwards. So I do a lot of pushing for social media afterwards, so people can interact and engage with me and give me feedback and tell me, oh, I really like the story, and this is how I felt, or I really didn't like your story, and this is how I felt too. So when it comes to creating this story, I always try to be mindful of who the audience is, but just to be honest with myself. When you're talking to certain aspects of oppression, certain aspects of colonization, it can be very triggering for people who are impacted from systems of oppression, especially if they're coming from a marginalized area. But there also can be some residual factors of guilt and shame from people who are on the opposite end of that. And I think halfway through my advocacy now, and now that I've been doing this for years now, is that sometimes I don't care if I offend anybody, and because that's how I stick with my morals. Because if I'm being impacted in a negative way in the world, and nobody cared about my feelings at that point, so even though I try to be mindful of the audience's feelings, I still try to stay true to the story. And if that means I drop an F-bomb here and there in doing so, or if it's a little bit more off canter, then so be it. That's how I'm going to be. So it's one thing when it comes to creating a story is to stay honest with yourself, be mindful of the audience who's listening, but really just sticking to the whole, like, the reasoning why you're there. So when I walk into a room, or if I walk into an audience, there's like always 3 different demographics that I'm looking for or trying to find, especially if it's at a conference or a gathering. Whereas, like, are there other Indigenous people who are self-identified that I can relate to and continue with that story or what that narration looks like? Are there other queer people within that space as well that I can connect with and figure out what their narrations are? And the third factor is, like, are there any smokers in the room? Because usually smokers have really, really interesting stories, and that's where a lot of the good debrief happens, outside in the smoking area. So yeah, so and then, I'm sorry, and I missed like the last question as well.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much. And then yeah, so the next question that here everybody already answered is, how do you make sure that that basically how do you help people telling stories?
So I've done.
The video wasn't clear enough. So how do you encourage people to tell their own story? I think you partially answered in a way, but if you have something to add to this?
No, no. So I've been involved with that in Sault Ste. Marie. There was a group called the Sioux Indigenous Writers Collective that I had started up, and it was a group of different writers and poets and spoken word artists to come together and just share their thoughts, and also share what pieces they've been working on or kind of projects they've been trying to develop. But there was always some kind of writing component for each gathering or each meeting that we did. So and it was usually led by different writers within the group. So a lot of times it's like we just try to engage with people with other topics. So we would like randomly, we've used focuses where we use like different writing games or like writing like exercises that we would do in a kind of a group setting, to something as basic as flipping open up a magazine or a book and then choosing one line, and that would be everyone's anchoring to begin their piece, and whatever that piece would be to develop. So there's different handles that different work for different people. So with the children, you might want to do something more very playful. You want to use a toy or like something just like on my desk. I have a purple pen. I have like a purple pen that also looks like a bird. It's kind of fluffy, and like we can pass that around, and people can generate ideas. So it's just like by holding onto that item, looking onto that item, like, okay, well, what does this mean? What does it say? What does it represent? How does it feeling? And then so I've done a brainstorming exercise with children where we would take an item, and then we would distract and figure out what those feelings are, how we're impacted by this item. So the look, the color, the smell, if there's a color, the texture of it. And then we try to think about, okay, well, what does that remind us of? Does it remind us of a place? Does it remind us of a character? Does it remind us of a story that our grandmothers once told us way back when we were a child? And then we develop a story together from there. So again, depending on what your project is and depending who the audience is, there's different avenues on how to engage with people and get them to write. And the important thing about it too is just to encourage people to try and write. I live by the mantra of try, learn, repeat, where if you don't know how to do something, the only thing you can do is just try it first, learn from that process. If it went well, then repeat that process. And if it didn't work well, learn from it, and then try again. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Teddy. Yeah, so as the time is passing, I'd like to jump to the last question because it's a very important one in view in particular of our youth video challenge. It's kind of linked to the one you just answered, but this one I wanted specifically geared towards youth, and it's true that here you gave us already some answers, but I'd like to hear everyone about this. Basically, the question is, how do you encourage youth to find their voice through storytelling? So it's not necessarily telling their stories, but it's finding their voice through storytelling. Who wants to answer this? Maybe Chris, if you need to leave at 4:30.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, youth are a unique group as well to think about how to get them to tell their story. A lot of young people often think they don't have enough life experience yet to make up a story, which is not true a week after they're born, except that they can't speak, you know. So I suppose one answer, which goes on from what I was saying before, in terms of how to encourage young people to tell their stories, is to be curious in their stories. As the listener, so if you're in the position of encouraging young people to tell their stories, learning to practice curiosity is really crucial. And I encourage you not to be naive about how you think you practice curiosity. It's worth reflecting on what curiosity is all about in your own experience as well. And some of the tropes of curiosity are the kind of active listening things that we've talked about. But those are tropes. Those are tricks, behavioral things. Actually, being curious is more of a, dare I say, ontological state. Learning to be curious, it's how we are. Some people just aren't necessarily that curious in other people, and that's okay, because you can learn to be curious in a particular context. And for a young person, for anybody to tell their story, but I think for young people often who think they don't have a story yet, that curiosity can be the lever that draws out the stories that are in them, that are they're absolutely there. Maybe another thing to add to curiosity is to have faith that the story is there, even if there isn't any evidence of that story, which is what faith is about, if you're into faith, you know. And so to practice that belief, that faith, that a story is there, and then to exercise the patience and compassion that is also part of the curiosity that you can exercise to draw that story out. There's so much more to say, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. If you, I was just wondering if you want to go now. Can you stay a little bit more?
I need to catch the bus back.
Yeah. So I want to just take a small break, just to take a thank you very much for your participation. Thank you so much. It was really. I wish you could stay because there's transactions going on.
Can you get me to the subway line? If you can get me to the Bloor line by 5, like.
Absolutely.
Ready?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
I'm driving to Peter and King. I'm going right down.
Okay, if you cross the Bloor line and I'm on it by 5, then I'll get my kids.
So just a beautiful story was just written of friendship, of new friendship, of fatherhood, of tons of things, and of transportation, which in Toronto is always like where all stories begin and end. Yeah. No, don't say that, Kevin. Yeah. Be optimistic. You're supposed to. Does someone want to add? So Anna?
How do you get this thing there?
Okay.
Okay, there I am. I totally agree that everybody has a story. When I was teaching younger kids, they have stories from the time that they can talk, and they'll tell you what happened on their way to school. They'll tell you the argument they got into with their brother. Everybody has a story, and I think with the young adults, the hard part is getting them past the stage where they're not afraid to speak up in front of other people, getting over that fear. And so one of the things that's really important is to give them opportunities. And I think our world is changing a little bit. When I started storytelling, we were pretty much into folk tales and fairy tales and legends and sagas and so forth. And now we're stepping in a big way into personal stories. And you have the moth, for example, in the States and even in Canada. And there are so many opportunities for young people to come out and to tell their stories and to hear other tellers. And I think they need to hear other tellers in order to get over that, maybe that initial fear of standing up in front of an audience, because standing in front of the audience and opening your mouth and taking a chance, that's got to be one of the hardest things to do in life. It's really difficult. So, you know, model and pray that your first experience goes well, because I think if your first experience goes well, most people will try it again.
Thank you very much, Anna. Does somebody wants to add something about this question?
May I add a couple things?
Yeah. I'll add research, you know, maybe as well. Like Anna just mentioned, folk tales and fairy tales, all of that. And I would encourage, as part of the process, is to, but again, this can be for young people as well as for people teaching young people or drawing out from young people as well, as do research. Now, what I'm referring to is two kinds of research. One is researching your own experience of telling and listening to stories. What stories work for you? What storytelling have you enjoyed? You know, what works? And again, everybody has an answer, you know, has experience of that, young people too. So when I'm working with young people around this, I do ask them literally, well, what story have you heard, or what novel or movie have you seen that, you know, that you've enjoyed recently, and why? What worked about it? You know, what part of the story interested you? Now, and then the other kind of research, apart from just our own experience, is to recognize that we live in a world that is so incredibly abundant in oral traditions, in stuff that has been published, in wisdom tales and wonder tales and fairy tales and folk tales and legends and myths and all the different things we call stories as well. And the myths, as an example, some of those are thousands of years old, and they're still around. Why? You know, they work. What about them works? You know, a lot of us know pieces of myths, if not whole myths, whether it's the Greek classical myths or myths from the cultures from which people come. There's no culture in the world that doesn't have those. Even if you haven't been raised in an oral tradition, you'll have been exposed to some of that, and it's available to us in a way like never before, you know, with the technologies that we have. So look at those stories and ask yourself, like, what of those stories work? And because within those stories are patterns that can reveal to us the patterns in our lives as well. And I'll give one quick example. It's a story that Chinua Achebe puts in Anthills of the Savannah. And this is the shortest way I've ever told it. You know, a leopard stops a tortoise and is about to kill it when the tortoise says, "Just give me a moment." And the leopard's like, "Okay, whatever, you're not going to get away." And the tortoise starts to run back and forth on the path, turns itself over again and again and again, makes a huge dust up on the path, and the leopard's like, "What did you do that for?" And the tortoise said, "Well, it's so that when people come along and see my carcass, my corpse, they will know that a great battle happened here." And that story, you know, it's funny, you know, but it's also the pattern of many of our lives as well. And those stories, very small and humble sometimes, and in surprising places, you know, can reveal to us patterns in our lives, so that it becomes part of the way we tell our own stories, tell those stories as well. They're available to us.
You know, they're available to us within our cultures as well. So if you are from a particular oral tradition or culture that still has those practices, what stories are being told? We own those within our cultures in ways that we don't own other stories, which doesn't mean we can't tell stories from other cultures as well. But it's worth being mindful of how we do that, you know, as well, to avoid the kind of misappropriation of stories that is also part of what the Canadian Race Relations Foundation is all about, what we're talking about here too. So.
That is great, and for the record, I don't find the tortoise story funny. I find it very touching. I want to cry.
Yeah.
True. I find it terribly touching. And it's a great story, by the way. Chirita, can you please add something?
Yeah, I just have two thoughts that I think flow very well from what Chris has just said. I think that in working with youth to find their voice through storytelling, one thought might be to look at the cultural resources that are available, and in that I'm thinking of an example which would be, say, Irish culture. Recently I started watching my family and just sort of listening in a new way about the way that stories were being used in our conversations, and it occurs to me that there's this great word in Irish called crack, C-R-A-I-C, crack. What's the crack? What's the crack? What's going on? And the answer is everything. The answer is, like, you need to have a story to answer when you say somebody. It's not how are you. It's, hey, how's it going? What's the crack? And the status in the relationship, the amount of enjoyment in terms of the dialogue is going to depend on whether you're bringing something to the conversation, which is, you will never guess what happened to me. You won't believe what just happened. So you either make someone fall over with the laughter, or you get them to gasp with astonishment and say, "Oh, can you believe that one?" You know, so it's sort of a status and something that one brings to the conversation and the relationship. And I have a feeling that that is not an unusual thing in youth culture, in youth cultures. The idea of telling a story and gaining status from that, or gaining a kind of a place within the community from the ability to tell a story, might be something that could be encouraged, and maybe that could be something to build on, that kind of cultural resource. And also another cultural kind of moment I think that we are in right now is that digital storytelling might be something that they could really become attracted to. The use of audio and the combination of audio and video, or audio and photography, bringing those two things together in the creation of a digital story might also be of great appeal to many young people. And I think of both of those things as kind of cultural questions to ask in terms of engaging youth.
Thank you very much, Teresa. So we'll ask now Teddy if he has something to add to this question.
It's interesting. I think it just comes down to sharing, providing the different ways of how they can share their story. So how Teresa had mentioned, digital storytelling is very big, right? Is a huge factor for youth components right now. We can YouTube anything to get the information that we need at the click of a mouse, and I think that's where a lot of the generations are looking at, where you have a lot of youth who already have or are following their peers who are also identify as youth, who are also younger, who are also living the same life experiences, but also have some kind of representation online, either through YouTube or Tumblr or Facebook, etc. And I think those are the really narrations where they can it's one thing to be able to tell their story, but also to share their story to other audiences, because it's the one thing I think a lot of people too is it's one thing that we're able to tell stories, but if there's nobody on the other end listening to it, then really you're only talking to yourself and telling your story over and over again. But I think it's almost like that validation that a lot of youth need to. It's if I could make this post, and how many likes can I get onto it? How many people are going to view it? How many people are going to create a little bit of an ego for me, but sometimes that ego or pride is kind of healthy and well-being, because it's that reassurance or that validation of like, yes, we can hear your story, yes, we can hear your narration, your dialogue, and I'm going to like your event, or I'm going to share your story with other people, because maybe how your story can be impacted by others. So I think when you're looking at modern storytelling today, introducing a digital component of it is key, whether that be a blog post or with digital storytelling, with using video and other aspects of media.
Thank you very much. So I think unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up this discussion. I think there will maybe, yeah, there's so many things that could be said. Hopefully we'll have other occasion to continue. I really hope that the CRF is going to continue. And I really think so, because I think there is so much that storytelling can do in what we're doing, and as we've seen during this webinar. Before leaving, everyone, just like say a final word, and maybe I know that Chris has like a very, very good resource to propose you. Well, first, I hope that this webinar has helped raise awareness about the value of storytelling. We at the CRRF believe that Canadian youth should be encouraged to tell their own stories, and our 2016 Youth Challenge provides a good way to do exactly that. So we hope that those of you who are educators, mentors, counselors will encourage the youth you are working with to write a short story, a poem, or an essay, or to film a short video that explore young Canadians' perspectives and Canadian values, and to submit it to our jury. The CRF will promote the winning entry to our social media channels to showcase the diversity of insight and vision of Canadian youth. And there's some of great prizes if you win. It's always good. I mean, you know, it's important to have your voice heard. That's a very important thing. That's most important, but prizes are good. Entries will be accepted up until midnight Eastern Time on August 30th, and you will find all information on our website, www.crrf-fcr.ca under Youth Challenge. So thank you very much to everyone to our participation. So I'm going to let you, each of you, say like a final word of conclusion. We'll begin by Chris.
Yeah, by way of conclusion, I'll just recommend, if you want to continue in a dialogue about storytelling, which is not for everybody, just get to the stories already too. But if you're interested in more depth about storytelling and narrative and all that, there is a wonderful website project called The Biology of Story. The website is simply biologyofstory.com. And it's done by a Toronto filmmaker who interviewed over 110 storytellers, playwrights, screenwriters, actors, stand-up comedians. Like, it's an unbelievable collection of interviews. It's over 1,000 videos that you can watch, and it's all curated in all sorts of different themes and stuff like that. So they interviewed me, they interviewed Dan Yashinsky, somebody that some of us here know as a storyteller in Toronto. They interviewed, you know, Stephen Bochco, the guy who did NYPD Blue in New York, you know. And so incredible different perspectives on storytelling and narrative, and a tremendous resource. So biologyofstory.com, really worth checking out. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe Bernice, do you want to? That's okay. Anna? That's all right. You get it?
Yes. All right, since you told a story, I'm going to tell you that for most storytellers, there is one story that is really powerful, and that has to do with two sisters. You know the one I'm going to tell, right? The one who is named Truth and the other named Story. And Truth went out every morning. She rolled out of bed just the way she was, with the crud in her eyes and her hair sticking out. And she went out naked as the day she was born, and she approached everybody she met and tried to tell her truth. And people turned from her because she was hard to hear. But when Story went out, she got up in the morning, she got dressed, she put on gloves, she put on a hat with her feather in it, and she looked elegant. And when she went out to speak to people, they all smiled, and she smiled, and they listened to what she had to say. And the power of story is really, really strong. Tell a story. You can get your message across, you can get your feelings out, you can get everything important in a story, and people will remember it. I remember stories that my mother told me when I was 6, and that was a heck of a long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Kevin?
I am Kevin, son of Walter and Teresa, grandson of Albert and Mary, lord of the wonky ping pong table in the basement and the slowest eater on Thanksgiving each year. Who are you?
Thank you very much. Teresa?
I'd just like to say thank you. It was a really wonderful experience to be in the company of such insightful storytellers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think there's a couple of things that would like to mention is the importance of mentorship and the importance of intergenerational learning. I think it's one thing is for if it's elder storytellers or who can understand how youth either facilitate or narrate their own stories within this world. Maybe it's an opportunity where we can just stop and listen and to hear what their stories are and how they're telling those stories, and opening up those doors for mentorship and intergenerational learning, where youth can assist either older storytellers or elder storytellers to become more proficient within aspects of social media, and how those elder storytellers can teach youth the importance of traditional storytelling, or how to put a story, how to be to refine their skills. So if there was anything, I would just like to say thank you, but also to be mindful of opportunities for mentorship and intergenerational learning. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Teddy. Just to finish, also, I want to give a little sign to Ika Sadhu and Sarah Busar, because they made a lot of effort to try to be here with us today, and they could not, at the last minute, although I'm really grateful for all their efforts, for their willingness to participate to this webinar, and we would have loved to hear their voices on this. But also thank you to all of you. We really appreciate that you made this effort. It was tremendously interesting. I think this is a webinar that's going to be very, very useful, because there's been a lot of things that have been said, and I hope we'll have the occasion to continue this conversation. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you who have attended the webinar. Take care. À bientôt. Avec grand plaisir.